Welcome back to the Bipartisan Brief. I'm your host, Peter Sweathelm, and we're going to do our weekly 15-minute coverage of what COVID-19 looks like globally. And we're going to begin internationally. The biggest increase in testing capacity per capita, the 10 nations that did the best in that category, were Bolivia for the fifth week in a row, Guatemala, Malawi, Saudi Arabia, India, and Colombia for the second week in a row, then Nigeria, Brazil, the Philippines, and the Ivory Coast. And it's really good to see South America ramping up that testing capacity. Same thing with India. Now moving on to the countries that saw the smallest increase in testing capacity per capita. That's Guinea, Egypt, France, and the Sudan for the fifth week in a row. Niger, Yemen, and Benin. Niger for the fourth week in a row. Yemen for the third week in a row. Benin for the second week in a row. Ethiopia, Uzbekistan, and China. And we have to again hammer Macron in France. Just ridiculous that the French are not bothering to test their people. They have plenty of resources. And then, of course, it's concerning that Yemen's on the list for the third week in a row, but they're essentially a failed state right now, so what do you expect? And then China, it just is more than a little bit infuriating that the reason the Chinese testing increase is lower is mostly because they're the primary people selling tests globally. So they're getting wealthy on something that originated there, based at least in part on improper handling of animals, in which they did not do their job containing. And now they're profiting off it while not bothering to test their own people because they really don't care. Moving on to the biggest decrease in new cases. This is from 2 weeks ago versus last week. Those of you watching for the first time, we're comparing each nation, how they did the previous 7 days with the 7 days before that. And so the biggest decrease in new cases was Benin for the second week in a row, Nepal, Kazakhstan, South Sudan, Netherlands, Malawi, Burkina Faso, Malaysia, Somalia, and Ethiopia. And nearly that entire list is developing world. And obviously, as we've said before, the developing world doesn't have the resources to fight this thing. So seeing so many developing world nations heading in the right direction is very encouraging to me. And then the nations that saw the biggest increase in new cases as a percent, comparing 2 weeks ago to 1 week ago. Australia was on the list for the fourth week in a row. Japan, Greece, and Zambia were on the list for the second week in a row. Then Guinea, Cuba, the Philippines, Cameroon, Sri Lanka, and Tunisia. Now, in both Australia and Greece, to a lesser extent Japan, the overall number of cases is still relatively low. But as a percent, comparing yourself week over week, the fact that Australia is on that list 4 weeks in a row is really disastrous. So we're certainly wishing our friends down under best wishes in getting this thing back recontained because they did such a good job initially. And then the biggest decrease in new deaths with 100 minimum total deaths. Netherlands was on for the second week in a row. The Democratic Republic of Congo and Spain were both on the deaths going down list this week, despite the fact that both were on the deaths going up list last week, 10 worst countries in the world. So that's really good to see. Kazakhstan, UK, Ethiopia, Belgium, Chile, Yemen, and Senegal. And this whole list is fascinating. Great to see Spain because they had another spike in cases, had to re-implement some shutdowns in Catalan and I believe some other provinces. And then I want to talk politics for a second because the UK originally went with the Swedish model, then ditched it and went with pretty hardcore lockdowns. And we've seen so much good information coming out of the UK. So globally, the press tends to point to Bolsonaro and Trump while ignoring liberal leaders such as Macron and AMLO in Mexico who've done terrible jobs, and mostly not giving Boris Johnson enough praise. Again, he was in denial and pursued a reckless path initially. But if you ask me, based on all the numbers I've seen over the course of the last 2 months, he's really done a good job leading the UK during this time. And then, of course, Belgium and Chile, simply because they both were just devastated. In fact, I think they're 1-2 in the world in terms of deaths per capita. So to see the deaths going down in both those countries is awesome. And then Yemen. And who knows what the data actually is there because there's so many people dying from so many different things in that civil war-stricken country. But still, even that little bit of data point, that little data point is certainly encouraging to me. And then the biggest increase in new deaths. Romania for the second week in a row, Then Greece, India, France, South Africa, the Philippines, Dominican Republic, Kenya, Afghanistan, and Argentina. Argentina is really struggling. And don't forget, guys, we're not talking about the raw number of deaths. We're saying how many people died on average per day 2 weeks ago, how many people died on average per day the week most recently passed, and looking at the percentage change. That's our methodology here. And certainly discouraging to see Afghanistan on the list. Argentina's been hit incredibly hard. And you see with France, right? They're not anywhere on the new cases list because they're not testing. But deaths are going up there. And it's just incredibly irresponsible for a country with resources to not be bothering to put money into testing. I mean, honestly, shame on Macron. He's going to have a lot of egg on his face when this thing is over, and a lot of dead bodies that probably didn't need to die. So just a piss poor job on his part. This was maybe the most concerning part of the entire show this week. Last week there were 13 nations where both new cases in terms of a percent went up faster than new testing in terms of a percent. There were 34 this week compared with 13 last week and 16 2 weeks ago. So we're talking about we've more than doubled places where cases are going up faster than testing. And everybody wants to say, well, sure, the cases are going up, but that's because the testing is going up. Well, if the percent change of cases is higher than the percent change of testing, then clearly this is not simply a result of an increase in testing capacity. So to me, it's very concerning. Ghana's on this list for the 4th week in a row. Venezuela, 3rd week in a row. Australia, 2nd week in a row. Greece, 2nd week in a row. Japan, 2nd week in a row. South Korea, Tunisia, Spain, Yemen, Uzbekistan, Belgium, Sri Lanka, Romania, Canada, Portugal, Peru, Guinea, Uganda, Thailand, Cuba, Bolivia, the Philippines, India, Colombia, Mozambique, Argentina, Indonesia, South Africa, Morocco, Dominican Republic, Mexico, the USA, and Kenya. And I want to focus on Mexico and the USA in particular because this is the first time that either of those nations has been on the list. And it's deeply concerning because those two countries have been absolutely ravaged as it is. And now we see outbreaks outpacing new testing capacity, which is just a disaster. And then this number held steady. These are nations that are going the wrong direction in both new cases and new deaths. And there were 20 this week and 20 last week. So that's not good, obviously, but at least it's not aggressively trending the wrong way. And those countries are Argentina, South Africa, and Colombia for the 5th week in a row, Venezuela for the 4th week in a row, Azerbaijan for the 3rd week in a row, Kenya, Uzbekistan, and Romania for the 2nd week in a row, Mozambique, India, Greece, Dominican Republic, the Philippines, Afghanistan, Portugal, Indonesia, Iran, Nigeria, Bolivia, and Brazil. Certainly looking at South America, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil have been devastated. And you can see that they're now trending in the wrong direction again in both of the two major stats that we look at. And then certainly South Africa is on these lists way too much. And we're seeing India, Greece, and Afghanistan pop up on way too many of the negative lists. So lots of concerning stuff going out there as well. And then there were 16 nations this week where it was going the right direction in terms of both new cases and new deaths. There were 19 last week and 23 2 weeks ago. So we've seen in 2 weeks the good list has gone down by a full 1/3. And these countries are the UK, 5th week in a row, South Sudan, 4th week in a row, Chile, 4th week in a row, Egypt, 2nd week in a row, and then Turkey, Ecuador, Senegal, Sudan, Czechia, Sweden, the Netherlands, Jordan, Ethiopia, the DRC, Benin, and Kazakhstan. Now, we still don't know what the long-term effects of this disease are, and I've read some things that I found to be unbelievably concerning. But there's still a lot of information out there that indicates at the end of the day, achieving some level of herd immunity is really going to be the only way to beat this thing, especially because we don't know whether or not the vaccine is going to work. And so seeing Sweden on this list, given that they were the country that pursued herd immunity deliberately, there are other countries that did it accidentally, Mexico being one, Brazil being one, and the USA being one to a slightly lesser extent. So it's really good to see Sweden looking better because they've had a couple of rough weeks. And then Chile for the fourth week in a row, awesome. I mean, they just got hit so hard. Egypt has been on none of the good lists since we started doing this. So the fact that they've been on this list now for the second week in a row is great. And again, once again, hard to discredit the job Boris Johnson and his team have done when the UK is on this list for the fifth week in a row. And then the 10 best overall, and that's where we look at the increase in new testing as a percent, and we look at the increase or decrease in new cases as a percent, and the increase or decrease in new deaths as a percent, and we add them together. And the 10 best overall in the country, the UK is on the list for the second week in a row, then Senegal, Sweden, Czechia, South Sudan, Jordan, Netherlands, Ethiopia, Kazakhstan, and Benin. And it's great to see Ethiopia's had a lot of really negative data. It's great to see them on this list because, again, they're not a super well-resourced country. Czechia's been on so many bad lists the last 3 weeks, and to see them kind of pulling out and hopefully trending in the right direction is awesome. And then, again, Sweden, really encouraging. It's worrisome, the long-term effects, but it's still encouraging to see that their strategy seems to be paying off, at least at the moment. And then the 10 worst overall were Uzbekistan, Zambia, South Africa, Kenya, Mozambique, Greece, Romania, Philippines, Japan, and Guinea. And Japan and Greece, again, the raw numbers are still relatively low, but it's very concerning to see them trending in the wrong direction because this thing, of course, has exponential growth. And then South Africa has just been on so many bad lists lately, so we hope they're able to pull their act together sometime soon. Now, turning our attention to the United States of America, and this is looking at only the nations with at least 10 million people and at least 1,000 total cases. So we don't compare the USA to San Marino, a country with several thousand people, or any of the Caribbean islands, some of which are very small and have tiny populations. So based on that number, and I believe there were 77 this week, the USA is number 1 in the world in total cases, number 2 in total cases per capita, which is 1 spot worse. We were 3rd last week. Number 1 in total deaths, number 7 in deaths per capita, number 1 in total testing capacity, and number 4 in testing capacity per capita, which is 2 spots better. So we went the wrong direction in cases per capita, but the right direction in testing capacity per capita. And these two things are, of course, related. But still, none of these numbers are good. And then looking at the USA compared with itself this past week versus 2 weeks ago, we're now number 23. We're 23 in testing capacity in terms of how much we increased it. Again, we're number 2 overall, but in terms of how much we increased it 2 weeks ago versus this week, we're number 23, which is 3 better than we were last week. We're number 56 in new cases, which is not good, but it's actually 5 better than we did a week ago. We're 61st last week. We're 30th in new deaths, which is 1 worse. We were 31st a week ago. We were 31st a week ago. No, 29th a week ago. And then we're number 44 overall, which is 10 spots worse. So out of 77 nations, comparing ourselves the past week with 2 weeks ago, America was 44 out of 77, which is frankly just horrible. Now looking at the states, and we'll do the partisan scorecard at the end, which is one of my favorite parts. The 5 states that increased their testing capacity the most were Idaho and Montana for the second week in a row, then Nevada, South Carolina, and Texas. The 5 states where we saw the testing capacity increase the least were Massachusetts and North Dakota for the 4th week in a row, Rhode Island for the 3rd week in a row, and then New Hampshire and South Dakota for the 2nd week in a row. And you realize it's not a list you should be on 2 weeks in a row. Shame on those 5 governors, every last one of them. And then the 5 best states in terms of decrease in the number of new cases as a percent 2 weeks ago versus last week were Maine, New Hampshire, Delaware, New York, and Minnesota. And again, anytime New York's going in the right direction because Manhattan has such population density and such heavily used public transportation and a wildly incompetent mayor. So for them to be going in the right direction is huge because that's a place where if it picked up again, it could get really ugly in a hurry again. And then the 5 worst states in terms of the cases going up the most were West Virginia, New Jersey, Hawaii, Kentucky, and North Dakota. The total cases in Hawaii are still very low, but that's still just flat not a list that you want to be on, especially when tourism is such an important part of their economy. And then the 5 best states in terms of decrease in new deaths were Colorado, Nebraska, Rhode Island, South Dakota, and Minnesota. And the 5 worst states in terms of increase in new deaths were Maine, Idaho, North Dakota, Texas, and Utah. The 5 best states overall were Connecticut and New Hampshire for the second week in a row, then Colorado, Nebraska, and Minnesota. And Connecticut got hit hard, and so it's really nice to see them looking good 2 weeks in a row. And then the 5 worst states overall were Maine, Idaho, North Dakota, New Jersey, and Texas. Now turning to states that had good trends, new cases and new deaths, compared 2 weeks ago versus last week. There were 6 this week and only 5 last week, so slightly going in the right direction. New Hampshire and Arkansas, second week in a row, where both major statistical trends are going in the right direction. Then Kansas, North Carolina, Minnesota, and Connecticut. Great to see good things happening in Arkansas because it was really looking ugly for them. They had a really bad run. So to see them trending positively is really wonderful. And then, unfortunately, where states were the bad trends, where the trends were going badly in terms of new cases and new deaths, there were 18 this week compared with 14 last week, so that's not good. South Carolina and Florida were on this list for the 3rd week in a row. Nevada, Montana, Mississippi, California, Utah, and Texas made this list for the 2nd week in a row. And then North Dakota, Idaho, New Jersey, Tennessee, Oregon, New Mexico, D.C., Washington, Indiana, and Arizona. And you really hope that the governors of Florida and Texas get their shit together, because that's just embarrassing. And then very concerning with D.C. because they had some pretty good runs. But that's, again, a city with pretty high population density and heavily used public transportation and lots of underlying preconditions. So we hope that they pull things together and start heading in the right direction again. And then states where new cases rose faster than new testing. There were 7 this week compared with 17 last week, compared with 18 2 weeks ago. And this means that we're trending in the right direction in terms of our nation and our states figuring out the importance of testing. It's super concerning, like I've said repeatedly. Anytime new testing is going up less quickly than new cases, that's really a disaster. And so these 7 states where it's not going well, West Virginia, North Dakota, 2nd week in a row, and then Oklahoma, New Mexico, New Jersey, Hawaii, and Kentucky. And now finally turning to the partisan scorecard. Democrat-led states were mentioned 15 times in a positive sense and 17 times in a negative sense. Republican-led states were mentioned 11 times in a positive sense and 28 times in a negative sense. So a couple of things there. One, it's the first time that both Democrat-led states and Republican-led states were mentioned more times negatively than positively, and that is highly concerning. And the other thing I want to mention is, even though consistently since we started doing this 6 weeks ago, it's always Republican-led states mentioned negatively more often, that's in large part due to the fact that we didn't start looking at this in detail until after New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York had things a little bit more stable. So it's not completely fair because the red states were, for the most part, hit later. So we're going to see these things balance out. But again, deeply concerning that both Democrat-led states and Republican-led states were mentioned negatively more times than positively. So 58% of the positive mentions were Democrat-led states, and 42% of the positive mentions were Republican-led states. And then 65% of the negative mentions were Republican-led states, and 35% of the negative mentions were Democrat-led states. So that's about it for this week's coverage. Really appreciate you guys watching, and look forward to catching up next week on the Bipartisan Brief.